She wore black at my father's funeral and cried like she'd lost everything. By the end of the week, she made sure I actually had. I stood there in the damp grass, watching the casket lower, while my mother, Diane, leaned heavily on her sister's arm. Her sobs were loud, echoing across the quiet cemetery, drawing sympathetic looks from every relative in attendance. She smelled of expensive roses and acted like the world had stopped spinning because her husband was gone. I wanted to believe her grief was real, but I had lived with her for 29 years, and I knew how much she valued a good performance. My name is Caleb. I am a man who spent his entire life building a quiet, steady existence while staying as close as possible to my father. He was the one person in this world who always treated me like I mattered. While my mother spent her time chasing status, control, and the perfect appearance, my father was my emotional anchor. He was a quiet support in the background of my life, the one who promised me that one day, things would be okay. When the dirt hit the shiny wood of his casket, I realized I hadn't just lost a parent. I had lost the only person who ever stood between me and the woman now dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief. The atmosphere at my father's funeral was heavy, not just with sadness, but with a strange, polished tension. We returned to the family home afterward, a large, cold house filled with expensive furniture and even more expensive relatives. People moved through the rooms with formal condolences and quiet judgment. I walked through the hallways where I grew up, yet I felt like an absolute outsider in my own home. I was surrounded by people who looked at me as if I didn't belong there anymore, as if my presence was a small mistake that needed to be corrected. I work a modest job, nothing flashy or high status, which was always a point of contention for Diane. She wanted a son who was a corporate shark, someone she could brag about at her garden parties. Instead, she got me, someone who valued the same quiet, simple things my father did. During his final years, I was the one who was always there for him. I took him to his appointments, sat with him during the long nights of his illness, and listened to his stories. Diane was often too busy with her social committees to deal with the messy reality of a sick husband. Yet here she was, the center of attention, acting as if she were the only one who truly felt the loss. Growing up, my relationship with Diane was always strained. She valued the things my father never cared about: wealth, influence, and the way the neighbors perceived us. To her, I was a project that had failed. She made it very clear that I did not meet her high expectations. If I got a B in school, it was a disaster. If I chose a hobby she didn't find refined, she mocked it until I gave it up. My father, however, was the opposite. He always reminded me that I had worth just as I was. He was a safe place I ran to when her words became too sharp to bear. Because of her, I learned to stay quiet and avoid conflict at all costs. I became an expert at making myself small, so I wouldn't trigger one of her lectures. I relied on my father as my only safety net, believing that as long as he was around, she couldn't fully erase me. But now that net was gone. Standing in the kitchen of the large house, watching her direct the caterers with sharp, pointed finger, I felt the old fear creeping back. Without my father's calm presence to balance her out, Diane was becoming even more authoritative, her eyes constantly tracking my movements as if she were already planning my exit. In the days following the funeral, subtle shifts began to happen within the house. My mother started making significant decisions without consulting me at all. She began talking about selling my father's old truck, a vehicle he loved and promised I could keep. She started moving his personal belongings into boxes, acting as if he had never lived there. When I tried to ask about his finances or what his last wishes were, she would speak over me. If a relative asked me a question about how I was doing, she would cut in and answer for me, dismissing me like I was a small, incapable child. It was a slow, deliberate process of rewriting the family narrative. I would walk into a room and conversations would suddenly stop. My uncles and cousins would look at their feet or find something interesting across the room. It became crystal clear that my mother was framing a new reality, one where I had no place, no rights, and no future in the family estate. She was painting me as a dependent son who couldn't possibly manage on his own, using her grief as a shield against any criticism of her behavior. I felt the walls closing in, realizing that my father's death had given her the ultimate opportunity to take full control. The tension reached a boiling point a few days later when a formal gathering was called at the house. Diane told me it was just a formality to discuss the estate, but the presence of so many extended family members suggested otherwise. The living room was packed with aunts, uncles, and distant cousins. My mother stood at the very center of the room, looking composed and authoritative in a tailored navy suit. She held a stack of documents in her hand, like a scepter. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, yet perfectly controlled, just the way she liked it. I sat on a small chair near the back, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on me. I could see my Uncle Marcus and Aunt June whispering to each other, their faces grim. No one spoke to me. Diane cleared her throat, and the room went silent. She began by thanking everyone for their support during this difficult time, her voice trembling just enough to seem sincere. Then her tone shifted. It became cold and businesslike. She announced that she had been through my father's papers, and that it was time to settle the matter of his will and the future of the household. I gripped the armrest of my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. In front of the entire family, my mother made her move. She announced with absolute certainty that my father had left everything to her. Every asset, every bank account, and the very house we were standing in was now hers, and hers alone. She presented this as a settled, unchangeable fact. But she didn't stop there. She looked directly at me and told the room that I had always been dependent on them. She claimed that my father knew I wouldn't know how to handle responsibility anyway, and therefore he had decided it was best if she managed everything to protect me. The humiliation was instant and deep. I felt the heat rising in my face as she essentially called me a failure in front of everyone who knew me. Some of my relatives nodded slowly, as if her words confirmed what they had always thought of me. Others stayed silent, looking at the floor to avoid my gaze. No one challenged her. No one stood up and said, "Wait, Caleb was the one who actually cared for him." I stood there, blindsided and reduced to nothing in the one place I thought I still belonged. It was a total erasure of my relationship with my father. The silence that followed her announcement was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I looked around the room, desperate for a single friendly face, but found none. My uncles, who had often praised my dedication to my father in private, now sat like statues. Family friends who had seen me sitting by his hospital bed for weeks suddenly seemed interested in the patterns on the rug. No one defended me. I felt the crushing weight of every unspoken judgment they held against me. They all saw me through Diane's eyes now. The weak, lazy son who was lucky his mother was willing to look after him. I wanted to speak up. I wanted to tell them about the conversations I had with my father in the quiet hours of the night, where he spoke of his plans for me. But years of being dismissed and told my voice didn't matter held me back like a physical weight. My throat felt tight, and my eyes stung with tears I refused to let fall in front of her. I couldn't bear the pity or the scorn any longer. I stood up and left the room quietly, the sound of my own footsteps feeling like a retreat. I walked out of that house carrying more than just grief. I was carrying a heavy, jagged sense of betrayal. I spent the next 2 days in my small apartment, barely moving. The betrayal was a physical ache in my chest. I felt like a fool for believing my father would have protected me from Diane's ambition. I questioned everything, every memory, every promise he had made. I felt completely isolated, cut off from my family and my history. My phone remained silent. None of the relatives who had been at the house reached out to see if I was okay. I was truly the ghost now, just as my mother had always intended. I was ready to give up and let her have it all, just to stop the pain of fighting. Then, on the third day, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a name I hadn't seen in a long time, Mr. Harrison. He was my father's longtime attorney, and one of the few people my father trusted implicitly. I hesitated, wondering if he was calling to finalize my eviction from the family narrative. I answered with a shaky hello. Mr. Harrison's tone was calm, professional, and surprisingly firm. He told me that there was something my father had insisted be kept strictly confidential until at least a week after the funeral. He said it was urgent that we meet. "Caleb," Mr. Harrison said over the phone, his voice steadying my frantic thoughts. "Your father was a very deliberate man. He knew exactly what he was doing. He explained that there were documents that directly involved me, documents that completely contradicted everything my mother had claimed at the family gathering. I felt a sudden jolt of electricity run through me. Could it be possible? Had my father actually seen this coming? Mr. Harrison asked me to come to his office the following morning for a formal legal meeting. He mentioned that he had already sent a summons to my mother as well. I didn't sleep that night. I paced my small living room, thinking about the 200 words per chapter limit and how I needed to stay focused on the timeline. I thought about my father's quiet smiles and the way he used to pat my hand when Diane was being particularly difficult. Was this his final act of protection? I arrived at Mr. Harrison's office 20 minutes early the next day. I sat in the lobby, my hands tucked under my legs to stop them from shaking. I was terrified of hope, but I was even more terrified of what would happen if I didn't fight back. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of something other than sadness. I felt a need for the truth. Diane arrived 10 minutes late, of course. She walked into the conference room with her head held high, looking like she owned the entire building. She barely glanced at me, treating my presence as a minor annoyance. She sat across from me at the long mahogany table, her eyes fixed on Mr. Harrison. "I don't understand why we're here, Arthur," she said, her voice dripping with fake patience. "The estate is settled. I've already made the announcements." Mr. Harrison didn't look up from his briefcase as he spoke. "The estate is far from settled, Diane. Your husband left specific instructions that override your announcements." The room went cold as Mr. Harrison pulled out a thick manila folder. He looked at me with a small, knowing nod before beginning. "Caleb, your father spent the last 28 years building a safety net for you. He knew his family, and he knew how to protect what mattered." He began to read from the documents, his voice clear and clinical. It turned out that my father had structured almost all of his key assets, major investments, several properties, and multiple high-value accounts, directly in my name years ago. These were held under ironclad legal agreements that my mother had no power to override or even access. As Mr. Harrison continued, the truth revealed a level of planning I could never have imagined. My father hadn't just left me some money. He had effectively shifted the bulk of the family wealth to me long before he got sick. But the real kicker was the bad faith clauses. My father had included specific penalties triggered by any attempt to conceal, misrepresent, or withhold assets from the rightful beneficiary. If Diane tried to claim what was mine, she would be legally required to pay back triple the value of those assets as a penalty. The narrative she had so carefully constructed collapsed in an instant. I watched my mother's face as the realization hit her. The composed, authoritative mask she had worn at the funeral shattered. Her skin turned strange, pale gray, and her hand began to tremble as she reached for her water glass. She tried to speak, to protest, but Mr. Harrison held up a hand. "The documentation is registered and indisputable, Diane. Your attempt to claim these assets at the family meeting triggered the triple indemnity clauses. You don't just lose the house and the accounts. You now owe the estate and Caleb, far more than you ever tried to take." The fallout was immediate and devastating for her. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother lose her composure completely. She wasn't just losing money. She was losing her status, her control, and the very foundation of the refined life she had used to belittle me. The silence in the room was a different kind now. It was the silence of a predator who had suddenly become the prey. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock and a sudden, desperate calculation. But I didn't look away. I didn't feel the need to hide or make myself small. The news spread to the family like wildfire. The same relatives who had stayed silent during her public humiliation of me now found themselves in a very awkward position. Uncle Marcus and Aunt June were suddenly calling my phone, their voices filled with forced cheer and concern. The story of the dependent son was replaced by the story of the man my father had trusted with everything. The judgment I had felt at the funeral shifted onto Diane. People began to talk about how she had tried to cheat her own son, and how my father had outsmarted her from beyond the grave. In the end, I didn't need to say a single word of anger to her. At the final legal signing, I sat across from her and simply acknowledged the truth of the documents. I didn't argue, I didn't gloat, and I didn't seek revenge. I thanked Mr. Harrison for his service and for honoring my father's wishes. When the meeting was over, I stood up and walked out of the office with a level of peace I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being dismissed or ushered out of the room. I was the one choosing to leave on my own terms. My life changed after that, but not in the flashy way Diane would have expected. I didn't buy a mansion or start throwing lavish parties. To prove a point, I used the assets to build something steady and meaningful, something that belonged entirely to me. My mother's influence within the family withered away. It wasn't because of anything I did to hurt her. It was simply because the truth had reshaped how everyone saw her. She was no longer the grieving, noble widow. She was a woman who had been exposed by her own husband's foresight. Looking back, I realized that my father didn't just leave me a fortune. He left me a final act of belief. He knew I was strong enough to handle the truth, and he knew exactly what kind of person his wife was. He provided me with the protection I didn't know I needed and the trust one had always craved. I stopped measuring my worth through my mother's critical, status-obsessed eyes. I understood that I was never invisible to him, even when I felt like a ghost of the rest of the world. The house was eventually sold, as I had no desire to live in a place filled with so much coldness. I moved to a modest place with a garden, a place my father would have loved. Sometimes, I still think about that day at the funeral, the smell of the expensive roses, and the sound of Diane's performative sobs. But the memory doesn't hurt anymore. It's just a reminder that the truth isn't something that can be owned or controlled by those who value appearances over people. I finally have the quiet, steady life I always wanted, built on the ground my father prepared for me. The long-term aftermath taught me that true power doesn't come from shouting or controlling others. It comes from being seen and valued by the right people. My father saw me. He saw the son who sat with him, the son who cared, and the son who was worth protecting. That knowledge is worth more than any amount of triple indemnity penalties. I've built a career I enjoy and a circle of friends who treat me with the respect my mother never could. Diane lives a quiet life now, her social circle much smaller than it used to be, but that is her journey to walk. I often think about the question my father's legacy poses. Have you ever been underestimated, only to discover that someone believed in you more than you ever knew? I found my answer in a manila folder in a lawyer's office. My father's silence for 28 years wasn't an absence of love. It was the ultimate proof of it. He gave me the tools to stand on my own feet and the grace to walk away from the people who tried to erase me. And for that, I will be forever grateful. I am Caleb, and I am no longer a ghost. The weeks after the legal victory were a blur of paperwork and realizations. I found myself going to my father's old journals that Mr. Harrison had passed along to me. In them, he wrote about the polished rooms Diane loved so much and how he felt like a stranger in them, just like I did. He wrote about his hope that I would find a safe place that was truly mine. Reading his words felt like a second conversation with him, one where he was finally free to speak without Diane interrupting. It solidified my resolve to live a life of substance over style. I decided to use a portion of the inheritance to start a small foundation in my father's name. It focuses on supporting caregivers, the people who are often invisible in the background of illness, much like I was for him. I wanted to honor the responsible work that Diane always mocked. When I told Mr. Harrison about the plan, he smiled, a real, genuine smile. Your father will be incredibly proud, Caleb, he said. He knew you had a heart for the things that actually matter. It was the first time I felt like I was stepping out of his shadow and into a light we both shared. My mother tried to reach out a few months later. She sent a letter, written on her signature heavy cream stationery, asking if we could put the misunderstandings behind us. There was no apology in it, only a request for a meeting to discuss her financial situation. I read it once and realized that even after losing everything, she was still trying to negotiate her way back into control. I didn't feel anger, just a profound sense of distance. The woman who wrote that letter didn't know me at all. She only knew the version of me she had failed to dominate. I didn't reply to the letter. Some people might call that cold, but I saw it as a necessary boundary. My father had given me the resources to be free from her influence, and I wasn't going to throw that away out of misplaced sense of guilt. I spent that afternoon in my new garden, planting the same kind of hardy shrubs my father used to tend. The physical work was grounding. I realized that my glow-up wasn't about a new suit or a fancy car. It was about the internal shift of knowing I owed her nothing. not even my silence. The family dynamics continue to shift in fascinating ways. My cousin Noel, who had been one of the ones laughing at my mother's comments during the estate meeting, actually stopped by my office one day. He looked uncomfortable and apologized for how things had handled. "We just followed Diane's lead," he admitted. "We didn't know." I accepted his apology, but it reinforced a lesson that people generally align themselves with whoever they perceive as the winner. It made me cherish my friend Nina even more. She was the only one who had stood by me when I had nothing. Nina had been my rock during the ghost years. She was the one who listened to my fears about Diane and encouraged me to keep showing up for my father. When the truth came out, she didn't treat me differently because of the money. She just hugged me and said, "I told you he loved you." Having someone who saw my worth before the lawyer opened that manila folder was the greatest gift of all. It taught me that loyalty isn't bought. It's built in the margins of life, in the quiet moments when no one else is watching. As a year passed, the story of the widow who tried to take it all became a cautionary tale in our social circles. Diane's reputation never truly recovered. She moved out of the big house and into a smaller condo, complaining to anyone who would listen about the unfairness of the law. But the law hadn't been unfair. It had simply been precise. My father had used the very system she admired, the world of contracts and status, to ensure she couldn't hurt me. There was a beautiful, poetic justice in that which I appreciated more as time went on. I finally felt ready to visit my father's grave again. I went on a Tuesday morning, a day that felt ordinary and real. I sat on the grass and told him about the foundation, about Nina, and about the garden. I told him I was happy. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was talking to a memory. I felt like I was reporting back to a partner. I left a small, smooth stone on his headstone, a machinist tradition I'd read about. I walked away without looking back, knowing that while he was gone, the ground he built for me was solid under my feet. The final transition was the most internal one. I stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. I stopped looking for Diane's disapproval in the faces of strangers. I began to trust my own decisions, even the small ones. I realized that for over 29 years, I had been living in a defensive crouch, always ready for the next blow. My father's final gift was a permission to stand up straight. I started taking on more responsibility at work, and to my surprise, I was good at it. The dependence Diane claimed was just a prison she had built for me. I realized that my father's methodical love was the best kind of protection. It wasn't a shield that blocked the world out. It was a foundation that allowed me to face the world head on. He didn't try to change Diane. He just made sure her influence had a limit. That is what true guardianship looks like. It's the quiet, careful preparation of something that holds. I am Caleb, and for the first time in my life, I know exactly where I belong. I belong in a life built on truth, and that is a place Diane can never reach. The project of the foundation began to grow, and I found myself speaking at small events for family caregivers. It was a strange feeling to be the one at the center of the room, but this time, the attention wasn't based on judgment. It was based on shared experience. I met so many people who felt as invisible as I once did. People who were doing the hard, unglamorous work of loving someone through an illness. Telling them my story and my father's story felt like completing a circle. I wasn't just Caleb, the responsible son anymore. I was a man with a purpose. During one of these events, an older man came up to me and said, "Your father must have been quite a man to plan so far ahead for you." I smiled and told him that he was. But I also realized that the planning wasn't just about the money. It was about the message. By setting those triple penalty clauses, my father was saying, "My son's dignity is non-negotiable." He was setting a price on the disrespect he knew Diane would try to dish out. That realization made me feel more loved than the actual bank balance ever could. It was a fierce, protective kind of love. I eventually heard through my Aunt June that Diane had sold the last of her status jewelry to maintain her lifestyle. She was still refusing to admit she had done anything wrong, blaming bad legal advice for fallout. It was sad, in a way, to see someone so trapped in their own narrative. But I also knew I couldn't save her from herself. My father had given her 30 years to be a partner and a mother, and she had chosen to be a manager instead. The consequences were her own to manage now. I had finally stopped trying to be the fixer for her emotional messes. My focus remained on building my own legacy. I began working with Mr. Harrison to set up a scholarship fund for students who were also acting as primary caregivers for their parents. I wanted to make sure other Calebs out there knew they weren't alone and that their work had value. Mr. Harrison, now nearing retirement, told me it was the most rewarding work of his career. Most people use their inheritance to pull others down, he said. You're using yours to lift them up. Henry would have loved that. That was all the validation I needed. The 2-year anniversary of my father's death came and went. I spent the day with Nina, hiking in the hills where my father used to take me as a child. The air was crisp and clear, much like my life had become. We talked about the future, about the foundation, and about the quiet joy of a life lived on one's own terms. I realized that the cold I had felt in those polished rooms was finally gone. I had replaced it with the warmth of genuine connection and the heat of hard, meaningful work. I was no longer an outsider. I was the architect of my own world. I stopped checking the family's social circles. What people whispered about Diane, or me, no longer held any weight. I had learned that the narrative is only powerful if you agree to live inside it. Once I stepped outside and built my own, their words became just background noise. I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the modest job I had kept. It gave me a sense of normalcy and a reminder where I came from. My father was a machinist, a man who worked with his hands and respected the process. I was proud to be his son. In the quiet evenings, I sometimes sit by the window with a cup of tea and think about the manila folder. I think about the signatures, the dates, and the legal language that changed my life. But mostly, I think about the man who sat in his office or at the kitchen table, quietly making sure his son would be okay. He didn't need to be flashy. He didn't need to be the center of the room. He just needed to be there. And in the way that mattered most, he is still here. His belief in me is the light I use to navigate the world. I have found my safe place. It isn't a house or a bank account. It's the solid ground of knowing who I am. I am not the failure my mother saw. I am the man my father trusted. I have a voice, a purpose, and a future that is entirely mine to control. The truth was never Diane's to dictate, and once I understood that, I was truly free. I am Caleb, and I am standing on the ground my father built for me. And from here, the view is absolutely beautiful. As I look at the garden one last time before heading inside, I think of everyone else who might be sitting in a polished room, feeling like they don't belong. I want them to know that their worth isn't defined by the people who try to erase them. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one building the strongest foundation. Trust the process, do the work, and remember that there is always someone who sees you, even if they haven't said out loud yet. The truth has a way of coming to light, and when it does, it changes everything. I am 31 now, and the ghost is long gone. I live in the light of my father's belief and the strength of my own choices. Diane is a memory of a lesson learned, and Nina is the partner I always hoped for. My life is modest, steady, and filled with the kind of value that doesn't need a polished room to shine. I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Have you found your ground yet? Because once you do, no one can ever make you feel like an outsider again.